Hi, Alice. I can't start my video for some reason. Oh, now I can.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone. How are
Hear me?
you?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Humeira. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Nazmul. Looking very awake.
Yes.
Oh, well, I had two coffees between now and the evening, so I'm on caffeine basically, and I have one more cup of tea here. So.
Well prepared.
Yes,
I definitely owe you some coffee next time we meet, Nazmul.
that's fine. I actually, when you suggested the time to me, I was just calculating it, like I guess I was supposed to kind of say we are 8 hours kind of behind, but I thought 8 hours ahead, which is just like
Addition and subtraction are very confusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's why we're theorists and not quantitative political scientists.
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah,
say
no, but
that.
it's really all fine. How are you doing, Emma? Are you in Cambridge?
I'm doing well. Are the participants already in the session, or are we? Sorry, I just wanted to.
I think we'll let people in a moment.
Okay, so they're not in. I
Yeah.
couldn't.
I mean,
with-
also just
sorry, I just wanted to.
in terms of how PACT seminars usually work, we put up all our seminars on the website, and we do get a lot of traffic there. So
Great.
a bulk of it is
I just wanted to check if we were in a
yeah.
in a pre-chat waiting room, or if everyone could hear us.
All right, so
Alice
just
should be able to correct me if I'm wrong.
Well,
on that note,
it
I mean, I
it looks
actually
like there are people who
Oh,
can
are
hear
there?
us.
Sorry.
Because we have 11 participants. It
Yes.
doesn't say that they're not.
Okay, so we are live, therefore. Should we start and maybe catch up after the call?
sure.
All right, excellent. Right, well, welcome everyone. Apologies, I didn't know you were already here, but welcome nevertheless. And we're very pleased to have with us today Nazmul Sultan presenting his book with Humeira Iqtidar and Emma Stone McKinnon as discussants. I'm going to introduce Nazmul first, who will speak about his book for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll go to Humeira and Emma, who I'll introduce afterwards. So Nazmul Sultan is Assistant Professor of Political Theory in the Department of Political Science. Oh, it doesn't say where. University of British Columbia. And his research has appeared or is forthcoming in APSR, that's American Political Science Review, Political Theory, Review of Politics, among others. His fantastic book, Waiting for the People, Anti-Colonialism and the Idea of Democracy in India, studies how a foundational set of disputes over the terms of peoplehood underwrote the formation of the idea of democracy in colonial India. He looks at two different traditions of anti-colonial thought, which problematize the idea of peoplehood. He's also working on a second project on the global condition of 19th and 20th century political thought, both European and non-European. If you haven't read Nazmul's book, Waiting for the People, I'd strongly recommend you do so. For those of you who haven't read it, I'm hoping today's talk will give you the motivation, will give you all the reasons you need to look at this really insightful book. Over to you, Nazmul.
All right. Thank you, Udit, for this kind introduction, and thanks, Emma and Humeira, for joining this. This is I think the first panel I'm doing since the book has come out. So very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the book. Yeah, so I mean, I thought I would do something kind of a bit more informal. I have prepared some PowerPoints. Might it be possible to give me the screen sharing access? Okay. All right. So I actually start, and then maybe at some point, a few minutes in, I'll shift to the PowerPoints. Okay. All right. Okay. So as the subtitle of the book tells you, right, this is it is a study of the idea of democracy in Indian anti-colonial political thought. The connection between anti-colonialism and democracy is, historically quite apparent. I think the pantheon of anti-colonial political thought is kind of populated by many figures who believe that the end of empire and democratic founding should coincide. But neither scholars of anti-colonial political thought nor that of democracy tend to ask why this has been the case. Right? If you pick up one of the many books on the history or global history of democracy, it is quite likely that the anti-colonial movement will be kind of like, will be usually acknowledged, but there'll be some observations along the line of kind of diffusionism. Some of the earliest mid-century commentators, for instance, found the globalization of democracy entirely unsurprising. The imperial schooling in self-government, however imperfect, appeared to be the process that bridged the colonial era with that of the democratic age. So now some of these arguments received a mighty challenge from a host of scholars in the wake of the post-colonial turn. The post-colonial turn had many virtues, but I think it ultimately relegated the history of anti-colonial political thought to the all-consuming framework of nationalism. In fact, it is now customary to categorize 19th and 20th century Indian political thought as a subset of nationalism, which is simply often in short called anti-colonial nationalism. What anti-colonial thinkers sought on this view was national self-determination, one that had to do with affirming the national self against the imperial other. We're then left in often a curious position that the vast majority of the world adopted democracy as their political ideal. In the age of decolonization, democracy turns out to be somewhat of an afterthought, or at best a logical corollary of national self-determination. For anti-colonial thinkers who were preoccupied with overcoming empire. So broadly speaking, the book kind of tries to break free of this framing of the anti-colonial democratic project, among other things. But I thought I would focus today primarily on this kind of like theme of the book. So, I mean, like my talk today, I think will broadly focus on these two interrelated themes and two of the major themes of the book. On the one hand, we have a set of problems that I sum up under the kind of heading of the problem of peoplehood. So there is both the question of popular sovereignty and that of democratic government. They're both kind of like, I think, inextricably linked here. They're of course not conceptually synonymous, but they are, for the history of anti-colonial political thought, I think went hand in hand. And we need to pay attention to kind of the problem of peoplehood to understand the problem of democratic government and vice versa. The other problem that I'll also be discussing a little bit is this problem of anti-colonialism as as something primarily in terms of the history of political thought and primarily in the history of political thought specifically. So, I mean, so I'd like to begin by saying a few words on what I call the problem of peoplehood, right? So, to flesh out this argument, it might be useful, I guess, to say a few words on what I call the democratic legitimation of empire in the 19th century. So we're at this point, I think, all quite well aware of the intimacy between modern empires and liberalism, right? So liberal imperialism scholarship, I think, has really shed a great deal of light on the progressive legitimation of empire, specifically in the 19th century. One thing, though, I don't think we get all that clearly from the liberal imperialism scholarship is this kind of the question of democracy, how that kind of fit into the larger story. The key 19th century European thinkers of empire, many of whom are committed to the norm of democracy, they did not endorse imperial rule necessarily or merely because of the European superiority, whether it is superiority in terms of the claim to progress or civilization. In the global 19th century, democracy was neither simply a humanistic category nor merely a problem of reason and cognition, right? Whether you look at Tocqueville's Democracy in America or Mill's Considerations on Representative Government, democracy appears to be, or democracy was ineluctably mired in a paradoxical struggle with its own historical condition. The democratic legitimation of empire then was not an aberration. It was instead central to understanding and theorizing what John Stuart Mill once characterized as the time and place of democracy. So So before I guess I more specifically focus on the problem of peoplehood, I think I should say a few words about another key term or key problem for the book, which is that of developmentalism. So what has come to be known as developmentalism, often interchangeably used with progress, so it's just simultaneously committed to both global unity and hierarchy. It maintained the applicability of a single temporal process to all of the globe, but at the same time, the philosophical assumptions necessarily entailed a hierarchical order. So what I argue that, if you want to understand this larger story of developmentalism and this developmental kind of picture of the globe that appeared, in the 19th century very clearly, that we need to kind of center the category of peoplehood and relatedly the problem of popular sovereignty. The developmental hierarchy of the globe, politically speaking, was not so much understood as a hierarchy of government or laws, but rather specifically as a hierarchy of peoplehood. I think I'm going to start the kind of PowerPoints now because I might want to share a quote or two. Let me see. Can you all see that? So, I'm going to skip over this. So, there's some of the kind of interesting reflections on the state of Indian peoplehood by, for example, by Edwin Arnold writing on 1862, saying more or less that, the idea of the people was unknown to India. Or, for example, the quote that the book begins with from Bipin Chandra Pal in 1887, kind of also saying much the same, that Indian people was something that was absent or something that was brought into being the British were bringing this into being. It was still in the process in 1887. I would actually take a step back further and I would look at a very, I think, pivotal moment for the story of peoplehood in India. So the year was 1843. And this Bengali thinker called Dakshinaranjan Mukherjee, associated with Young Bengal, he gave a paper. It was called On the Present State of the Honorable East India Company's Court of Judicature and Police under the Bengal Presidency. So as those of you who read the book would know, the talk, his kind of paper in many ways was a very kind of very critical kind of take on the state of British rule, specifically in Bengal. It called East India Company basically as a body of merchants kind of ruling India without paying attention to any of norms of good government that basically constituted the key focus of the talk. It was, in a short, was very critical, right? And it's kind of the terms on which it critiqued the British kind of administration was entirely basically what he considered to be universal principles of government, like separation of powers. Specifically, it occupied basically, it preoccupied him primarily the problem of separation of powers. And again, this is something that he very much inherited from Ram Mohan Rai, many ways considered to be the first kind of important figure in the canon of Indian political thought. And he was also very kind of forthright about the fact that the principle of government, whether we look at India or look at kind of Europe, this is more or less the same. And he thought the basic principle of the government emerged very early in Indian history, and that basically is something that survived over the years. So it's not a story of progress in any straightforward sense. He does invoke some Scottish Enlightenment theme, but not at all in a specifically developmentalist kind of theme. But what I want to basically primarily kind of say is that once he kind of gave this paper, it was interrupted in the middle by a certain Captain Richardson, who was the principal of Hindu College. And the objection that he made that he agreed with Mukherjee in a way that the state of British administration, East India Company administration, was in many ways deeply kind of unjust. But he thought the kind of source of the problem lay less with the kind of the administration or the government and more with the state of Indian peoplehood. It's only basically, if a people are, for example, not literate enough, if they are not particularly kind of, let's say, economically or socially developed, which, that what it means is that the government can only work to a limited extent, right? So what basically Richardson said impromptu in the middle of the talk was taken up by many others, some commenting on this affair, such as a locally based friend of India put it, it is public opinion that is wanting here. The more the educated Indian youth examine the state of course, the more they'll discover that the remedy of existing evils lies more in the hands of the people than of the government. And many others kind of repeated similar points. So it is a pivotal point. What you see at this point, the debate over the corrupt governance of the British in India came to be bifurcated between the two poles, the government and the people. The gulf between Mukherjee and his critics was not simply a disagreement about apportioning blame. It involved a foundational dispute about the ground of political power. Mukherjee was certainly right in pointing out that the name of the people had become an excuse and an alibi, but his aggressive British critics were more than just shoring up the empire. Their confident rebuttals emanated instead from an ongoing collapse of the ideal of popular sovereignty into that of a progressive history. So in this inverted history of popular sovereignty, the developmental state of a people directly determined the scope of what a government could do. So as the successors of Ram Mohan and Mukherjee would soon find out, criticisms of empire had a strange knack of metamorphizing into pious offerings to imperial sovereignty in the age of democracies, what one might call tortured globalization. By the mid-19th century, empire itself had turned into a promise for future self-government. The perceived need to transform the historically backward and politically amorphous colonial masses into the people was the ideal shared by empire and its critics alike. So this is what I call the problem of peoplehood. So, the book is basically divided into basically, the 6 chapters of the book, but so they're all divided into each what I consider to be some of the most important kind of episodes in this kind of this larger story or contest about the problem, a theoretical contention about the problem of peoplehood. So begin with many ways with the story of colonial liberalism. So I'll quickly go over basically this 4 or 5 very important moments before I guess come back to some of the problem of anti-colonialism and that of democracy again. Let's see how we're doing time-wise. Okay. So very briefly, so colonial liberalism is these are the basically three thinkers I kind of focus on in the chapter, but Nauroji is really probably the most important one for me in this chapter. I have a lot to say about the way we frame this as a kind of a liberal kind of episode of Indian political thought. We can discuss this later, but so these thinkers like Dadabhai Nauroji, Surendranath Banerjee, and Ramesh Chandra Dutt, they were all variously kind of one may call the founding generations of the Indian National Congress. And they're all critical of basically British governance in India. They're all in many ways fiercely critical. Their critique of the British Empire, though, or the critique of basically specifically colonial administration, was not really so much a dispute about the diagnosis about the problem of peoplehood, but rather the remedy that was suggested, which is kind of a form of a development led by the colonial kind of government, right? So Nauroji in particular, but also Banerjee and Dutt, I think they embraced many ways the kind of bifurcation between sovereignty and government that emerged at this point. They all variously argued that instead of the British kind of governing India and developing its people, it would be basically both pragmatically and kind of in some ways normatively superior for the Indians to take charge of the government, right? So they're not asking initially for a full kind of control over the government. They're asking for certain things like limited representation and especially more participation in the kind of the civil services, the Indianization of civil services, as it was called. So their kind of like argument for, or the justifications for Indian self-government, both kind of like, so on the one side, it kind of led to basically often very kind of like, powerful framing and diagnosis of what rendered Indians kind of like incapable as a people. So the focus, especially in Nauroji, moved to the kind of the economic makeup of the Indian people. Whereas with someone like Banerjee, we saw a lot of focus on the kind of the more political side of the problem, such as national belonging, such as kind of the relationship between literacy and citizenship, this set of problems. So they both cover two elements, right? But of course, I mean, how do you kind of authorize, for example, self-government without basically claiming sovereignty? It was a theoretical kind of a profound dilemma, a profound basically problem for them. And as I argue in the book, basically through trial and error, they found what they thought was a very ingenious kind of solution, which is that they decided to appeal to the British people directly, right, in order to kind of authorize the demand for Indian self-government. I mean, this is the reason for some of them ran for the British Parliament. Nauroji famously became elected to the British Parliament eventually in the 1890s. So they ended up with a program of self-government without sovereignty. But self-government, Indian self-government here logically became tied up with British popular sovereignty. They basically, in many ways, kind of the political program was built around reaching and appealing to the British electorate. And this was, of course, many ways, kind of a very precarious kind of arrangement. And already in the 1890s, we see that this kind of the deep tension of this framework was kind of like being recognized and quite often fiercely criticized by their rivals. So in the 1890s, Aurobindo Ghosh, among others, kind of would point out, basically the terms that are used by the Swadeshi generation, right, so-called nationalist generation, as mendicancy, as begging, as politics of petition, these are all taking shape in this time. So what the book does, and what I try to show, these are all actually ultimately speaking to a genuine dilemma, a genuine split between self-government and popular sovereignty. Anyway, so fast forward, we have basically the Swaraj movement, which is when Nauroji gave a speech in 1906. I'm not going to basically rehearse the story, but he basically pushed his agenda further, saying that Indians want self-government without delay. He was trying to move away from basically more gradual reformist program and demanding basically, at least as a form of political kind of enactment, a direct and here and now basically claim for self-government. And this was something that was seized by who would be known as the Congress extremists. I mean, this would help kind of shape their identity as the Congress extremists, such as Bipin Chandra Pal, such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak and others. So they were kind of like, known as impassioned. They did not want to go through the traditional routes of limited representation and other things. So of course, I mean, it was, they didn't have to spend much time trying to establish the kind of illegitimacy or normative indefensibility of imperial rule. To be honest, even perspicacious imperial thinkers in the 19th century agreed that imperial rule is not normatively justifiable. The defense of empire was not based on its normative superiority. Anyway, so it did not involve much kind of philosophical or other normative struggle to establish why Indians should have self-government. The difficult challenge in many ways was for them, how do you authorize this kind of program of self-government, right? They all agreed that authorization should come from the people. It should be a collective authorization. So as Bipin Chandra Pal really grappled with the problem, he ended up in various, different ways with the diagnosis that although the Indian people should have self-government, the people themselves, in many ways, are not yet kind of, present as a sovereign kind of entity. So he would end up ultimately arguing for certain kind of, what came to be known as constructive Swadeshi, which is to say kind of like, building and cultivating organized institutions that are outside of the colonial state, slowly preparing Indians being prepared by themselves for future self-government. Tilak really struggled with it, eventual solution he ended up with a division between invisible government, in other words, sovereignty, and visible government, which is more like ordinary government as we understand it. And he wanted to leave basically the question of sovereignty to the British and have Indians kind of take over government. He at some point advocated boycotting, the more classic Swadeshi moves. But again, he was not able to transcend many ways the problem of peoplehood, not able to kind of claim and authorize the people as something that would kind of speak in a sovereign voice and basically lead to a new founding. And this was, of course, the case, not necessarily because, again, this is a deep problem in the sense that the people just could not just simply be claimed in the way that maybe we have become used to. One had to kind of to render their own story legible in many ways, had to establish that Indian peoples are a people, right? That they are kind of like the Indians are a people, that they are kind of like they meet all the kind of criteria that one associated with peoplehood, such as cohesion, such as kind of like certain level of literacy, certain level of economic kind of. So these are basically abstractions built from a very specific, you may say, European history. For better or worse, it was something that appeared to be the history and the concept appeared to be quite inextricable at this time. Right. So this, for me, many ways, set the ground for Gandhi. And why Gandhi had such a dramatic effect, a democratic effect on Indian anti-colonial movement. It is one of the major, in may say, big questions in Indian history, in 20th century Indian history. So I'm, my understanding and my kind of like argument here, what I propose in many ways, that of course, I think most would agree that Gandhi is a thinker of individual kind of moral self-rule. He makes no secret of it in his writing. Gandhi was as critical of appealing to the British as he was of appealing to the people. Here's a quote from Gandhi, from Hind Swaraj. Gandhi saying that, like, that among other things, that Swaraj, in the palm of our hands, do not consider this Swaraj to be like a dream. Here, there is no idea of sitting still. And also that it has to be experienced everyone for themselves. So how, so this is the problem in many ways. How did basically this otherwise very much a course of action very much focused on individual moral self-rule kind of ended up in many ways transforming Indian anti-colonial movement? The story that I want to tell, what I argue in the book, that this kind of proposal for individual moral self-authorization many ways escaped and in some certain ways kind of moved past the more difficult problem of collective authorization that kind of entangled Gandhi's predecessors. I have a lot to say about Gandhi, but I am going to be very brief here in interest of time. Then I basically take a look at another very a kind of innovative school of Indian political thought, the pluralist, or the anti-colonial federalist. Specifically, I look at B.N. Seal, Radhamohan Mukherjee, C.R. Das. And again, they had also very fascinating kind of, like approach to this problem that offered to kind of theorize the people as many-willed, as some who's as kind of like, something is fundamentally diffused. Sovereignty itself, they argue, should be conceived as a plural and divided kind of entity. What was more interesting about them, though, where they even surpassed their European contemporaries, they suggested that this vision of democracy actually also liberates Indians from what they called the unilinear theory of development. The fact that one could conceive the transition to democracy in terms of like what they called, Radhamohan Mukherjee called a multilinear kind of like trajectory. But the problem for them, which I think really what led to their what ensured that basically the Federalists ultimately would only occupy a minor chapter in the history of kind of Indian political anti-colonial movement, is this kind of their own dilemma of collective authorization. So C.R. Das, famous for many other things, for the Bengal Pact, which is an unprecedented, many ways, move that offered a kind of a very promising solution to specifically the Hindu-Muslim problem in Bengal. He wanted basically Hindu Muslims to be independent, to be their own community, to be sovereign in their own right. But in order to resist the empire, C.R. Das often found himself invoking the monist people, the one people that he otherwise was very critical of. There's a very fascinating story of intellectual kind of fair exchange and between C.R. Das and Mary Parker Follett, that fact that he built on Mary Parker Follett's quite idiosyncratic American kind of gloss on British pluralism. And so I'm happy to talk more about it later. But anyway, the problem really here became one of relying on collective authorization for resisting empire, while normatively, in many ways, advocating for basically a divided, plural kind of vision of sovereignty, and refusing to see as the people as a monist entity. All right, so this brings me to the final and the two things chapters and two people I really want to two problems I want to touch on. So, it has been naturalized in many ways in studies of Indian political thought, but also broadly in studies of anti-colonial political thought, that the solution that people like Nehru first put forward, which is basically a kind of, a program for independence, which kind of like naturally, as it were, dovetailed with the project of a post-colonial developmental state. But the journey to it was kind of intellectually, of course, contingent and quite not necessarily bound to happen. At the same time, the kind of his relationship with the problem of popular sovereignty is way more complicated than we often take it to be. I mean, I guess the scholars of India often do not pay as much attention because we equate universal suffrage often with the problem of popular sovereignty and miss out on some of the other more difficult problems that kind of like embattled Nehru and others. So Nehru in many ways returns to the kind of 19th century diagnosis of India's kind of problem of peoplehood. It's very much a social diagnosis of India's problem of peoplehood, right? So if he returns to that, how did he avoid the dilemma that Nauroji and others kind of could not quite break free of? So this is why I kind of like present the story as, on the one hand, basically, the main kind of like solution for popular Nehru was the idea of the planning state. It was very still kind of early kind of elements that were kind of taking shape in the 1920s. But Nehru thought that prior to basically 1920s, one might say, development or the development of the people was considered to be a relatively slow process. Whether Indians or the British were doing it, it was expected to be a slow and gradual process. Nehru thought with the kind of his new vision of the planning state that he kind of really collated together came from British futurist writings, some came from the Soviet Union, that the new state could really kind of mobilize a great deal of power and lead to a, basically an accelerated, rapid progress, as he was fond of saying. So he made a compromise here. One compromise was that, it is related to the larger story. And I know Udit and I talked about it, it's basically a wonderful paper also on parliamentary sovereignty here. This is the era of the kind of deflation of parliamentary sovereignty. Nehru basically did not put less emphasis on parliamentary sovereignty than many of his predecessors. In many ways, the power moved to the executive, to the planning kind of body. And he, thought that whatever the Indian people did suffer, organizing in Gandhi's protest movements, everything, it suffered, at least made it clear they authorized India's kind of severing of the British connection. But in terms of the positive program of founding, right, that specific vision of sovereignty that Nehru had in mind, this was kind of like primarily theory of state sovereignty and something that Nehru was not necessarily in his kind of more kind of honest moments. He was kind of like, I think, quite often admitted that the program of founding could not necessarily be deduced from basically popular will. And here also it should be said, the idea of approaching or understanding popular sovereignty to the framework of will itself kind of became, I would say, quite kind of weak in Indian kind of political thought at this point. All right. So Nehru derived authorization for independence, right? But to make it democratic founding in many ways, he needed an idea of basically a very distinctive idea of state sovereignty based on what I call an accelerationist developmentalism. All right, so I'm going to basically go forward a little bit and have to come back to this later. So the other important side of the story that I have not touched on so far. So the people, of course, the time of the people, the one that I've so far discussed mostly focused on what you may say kind of more things like from literacy to economic development to national cohesion. So these are all considered to be in many ways inextricably linked in the 19th century, right? Something that I clarify in the second chapter. But beginning with the Swadeshi era, we saw the specific problem about the boundary of the people and that about the fitness of the people really began to diverge. Especially already in the Swadeshi era, we saw the the problem of belonging in particular. That time of it ceased to be linear. It could be basically accessed in ways, in cultural and other ways. And this introduced a tension, the tension that has been since basically from that period onward has been really key to specifically the Hindu-Muslim conflict in Indian kind of political thought and in political life. So the final chapter in many ways kind of bring this together and looks at basically what I call the two times of the people, basically how they kind of came to a head in that period. So I look at someone like Jinnah, and when he's talking about, of course, he's many ways diagnosing and thinking about something, majoritarianism, an eminently democratic problem. But precisely because it gets dovetailed with the question of the illiteracy and backwardness of the majority masses, that someone like Jinnah, while he's not development, post-colonial development, he thought that it would be bifurcated along often basically these fault lines within the people, right? So this leads to many ways the splitting of the Indian people so that they both could be sovereign in their own right, at the same time also could basically, centralized, etc., etc. And of course, then there's the question of Ambedkar, which actually, really shed a great deal of light on basically how the people formation happens actually as a bounded entity, and his emphasis many ways on the importance of national oneness of a people kind of led him to give renewed importance to question of social reform, specifically the question of caste, and all this kind of like attendant problems about Pakistan and other things that I am happy to talk more about. But essentially, at this point, we're seeing a split between the two types of the people. That is really important to the many ways. When you think about Indian founding, we think about a partition. So I divide the founding story in basically two parts. One having to do with the program of developmental state, program of founding, but many ways that also kind of ultimately made the kind of the boundary problem irreconcilable with the founding of the centralized developmental state. Okay, so this is broadly the narrative I kind of share in the book. Now, finally, I would like to say kind of a few things on the broader problem of anti-colonialism, and I'll end on this note. Anti-colonialism, how to study it philosophically, historically, theoretically, has been a problem that I think is really kind of is a major concern of contemporary kind of academia, a number of disciplines. I think the kind of the framework that we inherited from the mid to late 20th century, I think in many ways remains kind of like with us, the framework of a denial and reclaiming certain things, rights, etc., where we think they're denied to the colonized, and then they're reclaimed by anti-colonial actors. Even thinkers kind of critical of the derivative discourse of anti-colonialism, I think sometimes they're not immune to this framing. And of course, in the story of nationalism, the fact that, the anti-colonial kind of movement, in many ways, kind of became, it's kind of like, it's very hard to often kind of completely eradicate, I guess, the national self versus imperial other framing. And of course, then we see other stories about anti-colonial, kind of the romantic side of anti-colonialism, the vindicationism of that, and David Scott and others kind of, I think, quite usefully formulated. And so we see kind of like this many ways of different ways of looking at it. And I have my issues with each of them, which I will bracket, but I'll just say a few things here, which is that, what comes out of this story in many ways, that anti-colonialism, on the one hand, in terms of anti-colonial democratic project, I do think that the relationship between the practice of self-rule and the abstract ideal of popular sovereignty, this kind of was at the heart of the anti-colonial democratic project in India. But at the same time, this endeavor meant that, Indian political thinkers in different points, in different ways, had to be fundamentally attentive to the globe, the picture of the globe that modern political thought differently kind of that presupposed or presupposes. For example, we see with Gandhi when he's talking about individual self-rule. This is he's trying to kind of like at the same time offer a different theory of different ways of thinking about the global one, which is fundamentally averse to kind of historical reasoning. We see with kind of Mukherjee and Seal, the desire to kind of make the globe as something that is kind of composed of a multilinear, what they call multilinear theory of development. With Nehru, we saw the acceleration was essentially a kind of a desire in many ways to kind of like, remake the globe on more commensurate kind of like, temporal kind of basis. So some of them were fundamentally critical of the developmental framework, some were not, but what I think really stands out even ultimately is a profound concern. So while they're theorizing democracy, they're also at the same time, insofar as they're thinking about empire at its kind of most abstract and I guess the most meaningful level, it was a theory of the global. So I will end on this note. I think I'm well past my time. Anyway, very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nazmul. That was fantastic. For those of you who don't know, Nazmul is joining us at 2 a.m. local time. I can only aspire to such coherence and being so articulate at 2 a.m. That's not often the case. Thanks a lot, Nazmul, for introducing the book. I'm very pleased to introduce now our two discussants today. We've got Humeira Iqtidar, who's Professor of Politics at King's College London. Humeira's research brings together post-colonial theory, comparative political theory, and Islamic thought with a focus on modern South Asia. Her research has been concerned with questions of justice and tolerance, the place of religion in contemporary political imagination, the politics of knowledge, and legacies of colonialism. And methodologically, she's argued for greater interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research, especially a kind of anthropological, ethnographic sensitivity in political theory. She was a recipient of the Britain and Ireland Association of Political Thought Mid-Career Prize in 2021, and her book, Secularizing Islamists, Jamaat-e-Islami and Jamaat-ud-Dawa in Pakistan, was published by University of Chicago Press in 2011. Her works also appeared in various journals like Political Theory, the European Journal of Political Theory, and the Journal of Politics. We've also got with us Emma Stone McKinnon, who's University Assistant Professor in the History of Modern Political Thought in the Faculty of History at Cambridge and a Fellow of Emmanuel College. She received her PhD in Political Science from the University of Chicago with a certificate in Human Rights Studies. She also holds an AM from the University of Chicago and an AB from Social Studies from Harvard. And before taking her post at the History Faculty at Cambridge, she was a Junior Research Fellow at Emmanuel College from 2017 to 2020. Her work has been published in Political Theory and Humanity and in the volumes Time, History and Political Thought, Cambridge University Press, 2023. It's also been published in the Blackwell Companion to Arthur Danto and Contingency in the Course of International Law, Oxford University Press, 2021. And her work has also been published in the Oxford Handbook of Cosmopolitanism. So thank you so much, Humeira and Emma, for joining us today. We'll start with Humeira's comments, and then I'll call on you, Emma, to comment on Nazmul's book. Over to you, Humeira.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Udit, for organizing this, and Nazmul for this fantastic book. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. I have a few comments and some questions really to spur further conversation. So let me start by saying how much I enjoyed the book. I loved the thoughtful reconstruction of the relationship between popular sovereignty and development in Indian anti-colonial thought. I think Nazmul helps us recognize the creativity with which Indian anti-colonial thinkers approached the not yet for you caveat built into ideas related to democracy. He shows us very skillfully how Indian anti-colonial thinkers and activists responded to and worked with the problem of this kind of division in sovereignty and this not yet caveat built into it. But what he really does very beautifully is also show us how this comes together in something that is really then becomes dominant through the 20th century, this vision of developmentalism that becomes embedded in post-colonial states in a very profound way. And he shows us how that relationship changed over time. So when there was, the book has various complexities that we will come to, but we get a sense of how ideas about moral and material development were sometimes connected and then perhaps in a more in a tighter embrace, and then they drift apart, or such that by the mid 20th century, the relationship is really quite transformed. I also have to say that in the parts of, so I've read about 4 chapters and the conclusion, Nazmul. I feel like I should have really, listening to you right now, I feel like I should have really also read that chapter, and I will go back to the chapter on Jinnah and Ambedkar. But I thought that what was really compelling was your reading of Gandhi's thought in particular, the way when you posit as such, then it really becomes possible for us to understand the force of Gandhi's intervention and how and why it carried the force that it did. So again, really appreciated that as well. And I really appreciated the assured touch with which you help us think about the periodization of liberal thought in India and the way it's been done in the past, and how we have, with Chris Bailey's work, with others, have tended to think about Ram Mohan Roy as the start of that period. And you want us to think about Ram Mohan Roy as kind of the end of one aspect, and then a much richer and a different conversation that takes on from there. So I think this is a book certainly that I will continue to think with for a long time. And thank you very much for that, for writing this. I had a few questions. I understand your interest in moving away from this whole kind of framing of nationalism. And that has really dominated anti-colonial thought. And in fact, it comes at a very fortuitous time for me. Emma and I are both, I think, struggling with meeting deadlines for for a volume. And my contribution to that volume has, since last year, has been renamed, and I'm now, that chapter is called Anti-Colonialism Without Nationalism. So I'm very sympathetic to the argument that you're making about not privileging nationalism when we think about anti-colonialism. And yet, of course, I think we also have to be cognizant of the fact that in democratic theory, in theories about democracy and popular sovereignty, nationalism and the idea of the nation has a role to play, right? There is, whether we are thinking about liberal nationalists such as David Miller, who Udit has had the privilege of working with as well, at least in the same department at Oxford, Margaret Moore, there's a whole range of people who grapple with the idea that democratic polities do need some level of homogeneity. They do need some level of building of the idea that these people need to somehow, these people belong together. And I wondered about the, it seemed to me that there was, in focusing on the people, you are letting go of that tension between people and the nation that is actually also endemic to this, to democratic theory, to visions of democracy, and certainly became really quite pronounced late 19th century onwards. You mentioned Mazzini, you mentioned the influence of Mazzini in passing, but for visions of democracy in the global South, Mazzini was also really important, right? So what is that relationship for you, at least in your understanding? And I guess, yeah, so the question is partly about you, what is your understanding, and partly about your choice to move away from the nation so so strongly in your writing up of this. The other somewhat broad question I wanted to raise was about other visions of authorizing governance and government beyond popular sovereignty. And so, because they were also there, right? And this comes from my concern around the fact that when we think about, especially on history of political thought literature on anti-colonial thought, I think there is more of a tendency to continue that engagement where we privilege European thinkers. And to some extent that is unavoidable, and that is, I mean, that is the historical fact, right? So so people like Mukherjee, Banerjee, etc., all of these people are actually drawing upon this wide net of resources from and this wide array of resources from the European tradition, but they are also drawing upon ideas from within the South Asian context. And so one of my dissatisfactions with this approach generally, and then in this book as well, I continue to seek for some of these other conversations, right? So India then emerges as a context that throws up certain problems, but doesn't really seem to provide the resources, intellectual resources, that these thinkers are also drawing upon. And even in your discussion of Gandhi, for instance, where he is really reworking the concept of Swaraj quite dramatically, he's drawing up on a whole host of resources, including, of course, certain visions. He goes back to the Vedas. He goes to certain visions of of selfhood, etc. Bipin Chandra Bal is, is part of Arya Samaj. So there are other traditions. There are other intellectual traditions that these thinkers are also drawing upon, and we don't really get a sense of that. So I just wanted to maybe push you to say a bit more about why that is the case, and why you haven't engaged with those visions of sovereignty. So for instance, in the with Maududi, who comes much later, that I've engaged with in the early 20th century, there's another vision of sovereignty that is where God is the sovereign. And so his resistance to popular sovereignty is to allow philosophical primacy to the people as authorizing that code under which government will be organized and formed, right? So he's actually really supportive of democracy as a functional way of coming to decisions that are generally consensus based, but not to allowing philosophical primacy to the idea of the people. So there were these other traditions and these other ways of thinking about the people and sovereignty that it seems that don't really feature much here. And finally, very quickly, I just wanted to, you ended on this, and I really also appreciated the conclusion because you draw things together very well there. I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on what is the interest in anti-colonial thought at this point, right? So why is there so much scholarship going back to that period and engaging with it? And you have alluded to the kind of romantic visions as well as, and other people have spoken about other concerns. Jennifer Pitts, for instance, has not really fully developed, but indicated that perhaps a concern with contemporary imperialisms is drawing us back to thinking about that high tide of anti-colonial thought. Others have made the argument that there is a certain impasse that we have reached in thinking about contemporary problems more generally, and so moving to the global south is one way in which we are attending to that impasse in Euro-American political theory, and the most kind of accessible part of global south thinking is anti-colonial thought. But I wanted to just hear, and this is really a question out of curiosity, your own interest and why you think there is a wider interest in anti-colonial thought at this moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Humeira. Over to Emma.
Thanks. So I've also appreciated this book massively and the chance to read it carefully as a final manuscript. I know we've been in dialogue about pieces of it for a long time, Nazmul, from the dissertation stage forward. But it's such an elegant book, and both elegant in its composition and at the individual sentence level in the writing. And it's just a very clear and compelling project, which has been fairly well covered already, both by Nazmul and by Humeira, so I won't do too much in the way of summary. But I do take these central projects of the book as articulating the project of Indian anti-colonial thought as a project of democratic theory, centered on the idea of the people and the centrality of that category of the people, not entirely as a set of answers, but as a set of questions or problems for politics. And in particular, I think this isn't part of what this highlights, and I'll come back to this at the end of the comments, is that we're seeing grappling with a set of problems for democracy and in across the different thinkers presented here, worked out in ways that engage with literatures on liberalism, on constituent power and republicanism, on populism implicitly and multiculturalism implicitly, but are really developing its own core conceptual vocabulary and maintains a clear focus throughout on democratic theory as a central problem. And I think in this way, a core part of the book, as Humeira highlighted as well, is a contribution to what I think is a growing revision in historiography of anti-colonialism to de-emphasize a kind of vulgar nationalism or sort of sovereignty first kind of nationalism, in thinking instead about internal forms of politics and also external forms of different ways of organizing the globe and the international, as core parts of anti-colonial political thought. And I take this book as a really welcome advance in a set of conversations that have been going on in that sort of decentering of a nationalist frame within the historiography of anti-colonial thought. And yet I think it's interesting within that it's that you're turning to the global at the end, but you're not centering sort of the international, but remaining focused on democratic theory here, and also with that centering questions of development rather than jettisoning a sort of liberal imperialist claim about a developmentalist story. You're thinking of that as highlighting a problem of development that's central to democracy itself, that's worked out in one classic form by Rousseau in the sort of that problem of a people being a source of authorization, but also not yet ready to rule, as an animating problem for democracy, but one that ties together concerns about democracy, the temporality of imperialism, and economic development later. And I appreciate as well that you're not constrained by the supposed division between the economic and political, but just writing against that completely throughout here, in a way that enriches the discussion of development, I think, throughout. I've organized this then into a set of comments. I think the big question I had was about the first big question I had was about that core problem of the people being ready versus needing more time to develop, and yet also being the source of authorization, that sort of two times of the people temporality problem. You're pointing to a variety of ways of working that out across the different chapters, I think most clearly in chapter 5. But there's one answer to this that comes up in anti-colonial political thought elsewhere, that I've been thinking about more recently and thinking about Fanon, is classically about revolution itself, as an answer, that revolution stands as a kind of ruptural moment, as an act that transforms the people and makes them ready to rule, in a way that is supposed to cut through that problem of development. And this is also, I think, relevant because it is part of an emphasis on sort of revolutionary time as opposed to a kind of gradualist time in thinking about sort of responses to the historical injustice of colonialism. So you see this in some ways in Robert Meister's work. I've been reading David Scott's new book over the weekend too, which I think emphasizes this as well. And it just struck me that revolution is not a central category for you here, and I guess part of what I'm wondering here is whether that's an intentional sidestepping, whether it's and whether you think it's sort of not a sufficient answer that revolution is supposed to sort of transform the people and make them ready. And you get I guess at the same time, I think there are moments where you are there are versions of that come through, which also makes me think so both Gandhi's emphasis on Hind Swaraj as a kind of individual ethical practice that, I mean, I appreciate your reading of Gandhi especially as well, and the emphasis of this as not a direct analog to rule, and yet there is an emphasis on self-transformation at some level, as part of the process of rule, and then similarly, I think peppered throughout the book, you get a language about birth and about motherhood that suggests a sort of moment of rupture that isn't exactly the same as a revolutionary time, but bears some similarity to a kind of revolutionary temporality. And I guess I'm wondering about the choice to avoid the category of revolution, and whether the kind of post-colonial founding you're describing, particularly in that 5th chapter, is an alternative way of thinking about that, about founding not as a moment of rupture or revolution, but as an effort to to avoid some of the romanticism potentially of thinking about that as a full break or a full rupture, but instead as a different configuration of a set of problems that have been continuous about the composition of the people itself. And I think that's important because I think it's also part of the role of development as its own kind of temporality throughout the book, in that there's the sort of liberal imperialist version of development as a sort of stadial waiting game versus development as a continuous project, so that development itself isn't being refused in the name of founding as a kind of rupture, but is being continued in different ways. That was one question. I think that brings me to a second question about the emphasis on a reading of this as an entry into democratic theory rather than a theory of revolution, or another alternative here would be as a sort of critique of colonialism. And I think there's a lot of, throughout the chapters, we're not getting whereas I think a lot of the emphasis in anti-colonial political thought has also been on what the critique of imperialism might be. And I think that might be the part that's driven, as Humeira was indicated, by a concern with how we understand imperialism in the present too. But the critique of empire is really not the emphasis of this book, and that's one of the things I appreciate about it. But I was wanted to sort of hear more about the choice to de-emphasize that too, because in some ways it seems like there is a critique of imperialism operating in the background, in the question of sort of what kind of developmentalism is appropriate, and yet this also means you're able to take liberal imperialism on its own terms and yet still refuse it, rather than get stuck on a sort of critique of bad faith. And that's part of what I appreciated about the turn too. And the one place where I was a little concerned about it is in the emphasis on self-determination, because I do think part of where self-determination does start to become a language of rights is in a description of imperialism as a denial of the right to self-determination. And I guess I'm wondering if you're thinking of self-determination entirely as part of a project of founding, or whether there's this kind of implicit critique of the wrong of imperial rule as a denial of self-determination in the background there. The related question here about the sort of de-emphasis on the critique of colonialism is not just about the relation to the literature and anti-colonial political thought now, but also a related question about the place of subaltern studies as a moment in both in Europe. There's occasional engagement with Guha in the footnotes, but they're part of what I find interesting in thinking about the place of anti-colonial political theory and contemporary political theory as a field is whether that so much of this, or an earlier moment of thinking about anti-colonial political thought, what we now call that, happened in the context of the subaltern studies group and an emphasis on post-colonial theory, in which India was really central, even though it's sometimes less central in contemporary anti-colonial political theory. And I guess I'm wondering about your relationship to that literature and what you think its continued relevance was, but also how it's helped shape interest in colonial political thought now. So that's in some ways a little unfair. It's two questions about things that you're not emphasizing, where I admire the choice not to emphasize them, but where I'm curious about where they're operating in the background, but also about if you just wanted to say more about that choice to de-emphasize them, both as a matter of the sort of emphasis on political theory of democracy, and also as an intervention in the directions of anti-colonial political theory now. But that also bridges into a different question about anti-colonial political thought, and particularly, again, comes back to your core effort about core point about decentering a story of anti-colonialism as a kind of nationalism, as well as a refusal of anti-colonialism as a story about truncation and completion, or the sort of expansion of pre-existing ideas. And I think those are both core points of this book and key directions in the current literature that you're contributing to clearly as well. You note in the chapter, what got me thinking about this is that you note in the chapter on federalism, and you're paraphrasing Moyne here, that you think part of the current interest in federalism may be driven by a dissatisfaction with what happened to newly independent states after this moment of post-colonial founding. And the book doesn't deal a lot with there's a bit in the conclusion, but with Indian history after 1947, and I guess I'm wondering what you think about that turn to consider the sort of turn in the historiography to think about the sort of fall of self-determination, as Adam Katachu's book puts it, or the sort of tragedy of post-colonial founding, as David Scott puts it. And I think there are allusions to this in the conclusion, but I guess I'm wondering if you think it's sort of a misplaced emphasis in the literature too. At the same time, a lot of what has driven that debate is a set of concerns about how you explain those perceived failures of newly independent states in the mid to late 20th century. So one, whether those failures are products of legacies of empire, or the persistence of new forms of imperialism, whether they're the product of anti-colonialism gone wrong and the product of sort of extreme forms of nationalism, as I think Adam's book suggests in places, whether they're the products of new external forces about the Cold War, or other changes, and those sort of questions of the legacies of colonialism, the internal contingencies or missteps, and external forces and new forms of imperialism. I think I don't think the literature has to resolve one of those rather than the other, but you do get different emphases in the current literature. And I take you to be actually offering a different way of thinking about this, or at least a different answer to it, which is that the problems that anti-colonial thinkers are grappling with are really big problems. That the composition of the people and the question is sort of inherent to problems of democratic theory itself. And those problems don't go away after the moment of post-colonial founding. And in that sense, part of what we're getting is a history of working out a problem of composing the people, rather than a history of sort of efforts to deal with that problem, rather than a history of successful answers that might then succeed or fail. And that means the book is avoiding a turn toward looking back at anti-colonialism for a set of paths not taken that might now be recovered in the present. I think that's part of what the federalism literature is doing that you're trying to avoid too. But I guess it runs into a different question, and this is my final big question about whether in some sense that means the fall or the failure or the tragedy of post-colonial states is a product of inherent problems of democratic theory, or sort of timeless paradoxes of democracy, to put it in an extreme form, or whether it's a specific problem that requires a different kind of explanation. There's an implicit question here as well that echoes Humeira's closing question about the current interest in anti-colonial political thought, which I think flows from a sort of, I find David Scott style question that the sort of historiographic turns in how we understand anti-colonialism are often reflections of the problem spaces in which that historiography is being written, rather than the problems in which anti-colonial political thinkers are themselves thinking. And whether in refusing some of the debates about the sort of fall of self-determination or failures of anti-colonialism, part of your assertion is that that's not the most relevant question, or that's not the question that's driving the thinkers you're looking at now. Okay, I might leave things there and give you some time to talk again. Thanks, but thank you again for the book.
Thank you both.
Over to you, Nazmul. I do have a few questions for you, but I'm going to park them for now. So a brief response to Humeira and Emma, then we can open it up for questions.
Thank you both for this really kind of, both very, I guess, generous but also provocative set of questions. And I think, yeah, I mean, I've thought basically about different parts of these questions, I think, for quite some time in different, during the course of writing this book. So I'm really glad to also get the opportunity to kind of think more about this with you. So I'm going to start with Humeira's questions. I'll try to go chronologically. And I think some of the questions will also overlap. So the question about nationalism, the first question that Humeira posed, I do take your point that, of course, that nationalism, especially if you just kind of approach it analytically, specifically often when people talk about nationalism in analytical political theory literature, often it involves questions of like, basically the boundary problem, questions of belonging, stuff like that. And this is, a problem that, one can't just get away with, right? As you would know also at the same time, the nationalism for anti-colonial political thought, especially for Indian history, this was just more than this, right? This was something that, in many ways, it was the kind of organizing principle. It was like the kind of the locus of everything, it just helped pull everything together in many ways. And I do kind of engage with this specific question of boundary problem in chapter 6. But early on, when I start the polemic a little bit, so of course, one thing that I wanted to basically make very clear, partly because in Indian political thought, we often are not aware of this as much as we should be, is there's a very specific history of thinking about kind of the nationalism as a democratic problem. So, you rightly brought up Mazzini, because the kind of the fascination with Mazzini in the 1870s and 80s really captured a growing Indian obsession with the problem of unity, the Indian unity, right? The kind of like whether India as a people, as a kind of as a collectivity, what brought them, united them together. This kind of like this opening that people like Surendranath Banerjee, I think most kind of like influentially kind of like generated, but this continued, right? For quite some time. And one thing the book does is to kind of like partly kind of, on the one hand, to kind of tell the stories of the transformation of these ways of thinking about unity. Because if you're thinking about national unity like Surendranath Banerjee did, like what does he do? He takes Mazzini, but he says the solution is not basically secret societies for India. If Indians are to be united, educated Indians, they need to impart education. Basically, the educated Indians with the vanguard, basically propagating the message of unity via railways, the new mode of kind of like, more accelerated kind of connections, etc. And of course, this would completely unravel in the early 20th century with the emergence of kind of, let's say, the more culturalist ways of thinking about the Indian past. And when we think about Swadeshi movement, of course, we most often think about, this aspect of like this ways of what people used to call, Indian historians used to call revivalism, which meant drawing up the boundary Indian identity by turning to its kind of, often Hindu past. And again, when we come to Nehru, for example, we see kind of a somewhat, in many ways, Nehru's least convincing moments in many ways, which is the idea that the growth of kind of economic development, more, intensified class struggle would kind of erase or many ways resolve India's misguided kind of like boundary problem and on religious and other lines. So this history itself is something that I wanted to kind of some level recuperate so that the nationalism or the national question is not just kind of in a way less than naturalized. And the other question for normatively, we have the problem that most of the anti-colonial thinkers, and I have like, India, or if you go look at India, but also like places beyond India, often are normatively very critical of nationalism. I mean, those are the flag bearer of nationalism, someone like Nehru or Gandhi. If normatively, they are just very hard to find them saying kind of like, at best, Nehru would make pragmatic arguments, but never basically particularly strong philosophical or other arguments about kind of like, is any endorsement of nationalism would be followed by expression of like his philosophical disapproval of this kind of like, So, I mean, so there's many things to kind of disentangle. The book was doing all of this, but ultimately, I mean, the way when you think about kind of like, let's say, the Indian peoplehood problem through the nationalism problem, it does two things. On the one hand, it renders, I think, this problem, what in many ways I think was a deeply philosophical struggle with the premise of modern empires, into a slightly kind of culturalist, slightly, I would not say entirely, story of this national self versus imperial other framing, where we kind of see that modernity was something desired, but it became almost immediately modernity was a European inheritance. Everything they wanted, Indian political, the modern things, is Europeanized. And this is the problem gets framed at that way. We do not necessarily look at basically how this kind of distilled into very specific problems of founding, very specific problems of thinking about, government, citizenship. So this is the kind of place from where which I think my kind of like, I guess, dissatisfaction with the framing of anti-colonial thought and anti-colonial nationalism started. And but just to I do not of course want to discount among Ambedkar, I think most convincingly made are the philosophical case for certain kind of cohesion was needed for democratic polity, but it led Ambedkar into certain paradoxes, such as his own struggle with the social reform, political reform, the priority of which one should come first. Should India become a nation first? The very intriguing quote he makes very early in the book that I start, that I reproduce very early in the book. So it is basically the belonging part, the boundary problem part does not go away. And the book actually, I think often, at some level tries to kind of clarify this problem, to identify the problem for it is, and not let it become basically all this other thing it becomes, as a kind of something subsumes basically, problems that are ultimately, if we approach them to nationalism, we lose handle of both nationalism and other questions that are ultimately, problems often sometimes in democratic theory, sometimes in matters of interpretation. Another question about and a question about like the other visions of authorization and sovereignty in Indian political thought. Now, I mean, of course, the book is a particular story, and in one way, the book is a retelling of the classic arc of Indian political thought. And because of the set of questions I was interested in, I mean, I was interested in some people initially when I was writing the book. I was interested in writing, Gandhi is someone who always interested me. I was interested in C.R. Das. But the narrative, for example, led me to Ram Mohan Rai. I initially did not anticipate writing about Ram Mohan Rai. So certain things happened in part because of the demand of the narrative. But the narrative in many ways, is organized around a set of questions, set of problems, which meant that, there are many people I deeply kind of enjoy. For example, Tagore is someone that I deeply kind of like enjoy reading and thinking with. For example, Bankim's writings on ethics, right? For example, Dharmatattva and other stuff. So anyway, so that people that did not make it into the book, who I would have liked to kind of think more about. But so this book, is speaking more in terms of South Asian historiography. So, I mean, the book is many ways, the book doesn't really say it directly, but it many ways comes out of a rethinking of the great debate in Indian kind of history in the 1990s about kind of this, whether colonialism was a form of break or not, right? And the way I think it, and is that, the fact that the question of arguments about break, many ways, has been now diluted. And many ways we see basically, for example, the growth of pre-modern scholarship in India, the Indian Ocean scholarship, or, many of these are many ways chipping it at the kind of the force of the conceptual break story that people, we see basically everything that we thought modern, many ways we kept would tell a pre-modern story. This is one manifestation, but this is something, of course, South Asian historiography, I think, many ways, living in the aftermath of the debate that is kind of, in many ways, not going anywhere, at least insofar as I can see it. So I think the story for me is primarily a story of not so much a story of fundamental social or sociological breaks. The story I don't think can be told entirely coherently as a story of the social. it is for me primarily a matter of intellectual break. And the people, for their, it was a term, as most European thinkers and also many level agree, was very modern even in Europe. It is a term that really comes of its own as a kind of political kind of concept in the 18th century. For Indians, of course, Indians had their own ways past. There are many terms that they thought about, in terms of thinking about the masses, the loka, there's many other things. But as a modern term, which is inflected by the problem of sovereignty, that this is kind of a distinctively new problem in Indian political thought. I think I just don't see any other way of kind of, I find that many fantasies of, let's say, reading the Sepoy Rebellion or some of the other pre-modern or early modern rebellion as incarnations of forms of popular sovereignty. Of course, these are not arguments I think often passingly made, not really seriously, not particularly satisfactory. But of course, in the modern era, we got alternative accounts of sovereignty, like someone like Modi is a completely innovative and ways of thinking about sovereignty that I think, kind of free from that problem that I just identified. So this book is committed in many ways to reading the kind of the emergence of colonial modernity in many ways as a story of intellectual break. And for me, it's not straightforward. It's not Ram Mohan Rai who's initiating the break. The break starts somewhere later. And there is some fundamental kind of like horizon of possibilities are changing, new concepts kind of like, Anyway, so this book, I do agree, though, I could have, there are many, of course, the vernacular thinking on these problems are deeply rich. And it's something that I want to do more in the future, kind of like, I'm starting a project on Tagore now. We are just doing a blue book series on Tagore, and later on, hopefully I'll write more on this, partly to kind of look at some of the ways of thinking about these problems that kind of like just evaded. It's not framed, let's say, in a more political theoretic terms that are kind of shared, but someone like Tagore, for example, really kind of pushes these terms, and hopefully I'll be able to kind of think further about this. But the main reason I see ultimately the way the story is presented, I would say, because of the larger story about break and my own investment in this. And I would love to actually talk to you more about this. Now, anti-colonial political thought, why now? I think this dovetails with Emma's questions, and maybe I'll come back to it toward the end. But Emma, I really loved both of your questions, in part because, of course, revolution is something that, one of the books that really inspired me to kind of turn to this project as a graduate student very early on was Arendt's On Revolution. This remains one of my most kind of like, I guess, favorite books. I don't go back to, and I feel like I'm not finding new ideas, just need to read something new that invigorate me. And a revolutionary tradition, of course, in Indian political life itself was incredibly important, especially in the later half of the 20th century and beyond. Of course, part of the story, as you rightly identified, is about, ways of thinking about kind of like political break, which is also in this case, because of reasons having to do with globalization, with empire, also a story of temporal break, right? And we saw kind of ways of thinking about time of development was conceived to be relatively slow and gradual. Something that, people like Macaulay or Mill could talk about the fact that the day India becomes kind of like fit for self-government, there'd be glorious day, etc. But it was not anywhere close. You could just kind of like, it was not a problem of the near future, in part because the progress was seen to be so kind of a slow process. Anyway, so this has to do with this is not just a matter of imperial ideology, it's also a matter of how European history itself was understood in this period, right? Europe's own transition was kind of, for many of these people like Mill and Macaulay in particular, was a very relatively slow and gradual process. Maybe there's a pushback against the French Revolution kind of ideals of break, especially in British political thought in the 19th century. Anyway, so this would change. We saw attempts to change it for Gandhi, and Gandhi would try to think of this kind of authorization without thinking through history, right? For him, history is something that is just a collection of like, interruption rather than a story of continuity. We saw the Federalists kind of try to give, pluralize the story of kind of how we think about transition stories. And of course, they try to pluralize, this is very important, right? Primarily for the sake of a democratic theory. Many of these turned to it so that they could theorize India's democracy anew, right? And this tells you partly about how important the story of democracy or peoplehood was to the stories of development and stories of progress. And of course, Nehru is someone in many ways where I think the problem really comes most sharply, right? So Nehru really, his idea of the founding, the fact that India could be, India could be independent and yet at the same time address the problem of democratic founding, how to be both free and democratic. At the heart of it was the idea of a basically revolutionary state, the idea of a planning state. And he made a series of compromises. He does not want the Soviet model per se, but he really wants basically the essence of their work, which is this kind of dramatized, accelerated industrialization, etc., etc., as an attempt to domesticate revolution that really kind of drives his thinking. But now, if you kind of generalize the Nehruvian movement or Nehru's movement, of course, this was part of a broader international anti-colonial movement, which is kind of like, found in the later, I guess, kind of figure in this longer story that starts from the kind of interwar era. Which is kind of trying to think of anti-colonial founding as, as some level as a revolutionary founding. And because one could think of revolutionary founding, it also had post-Nehru, post-1940s, I think, anti-colonial political thought also had this founding began to be a lot more elements of the sublime that modern revolutionary tradition kind of entailed. And Indian founding basically started a bit early, in part because it's a gradual kind of turn. Founding was not necessarily as conceived as revolutionary terms as many others did of other foundings in Asia and Africa in the 60s in particular. So anyway, so I do think the question of how to think about revolutionary founding, especially via Nehru, this was kind of something that ultimately played a very important role, this kind of essential kind of feature of revolution, this dramatic kind of change. But it was, of course, often not conceptualized, I would say, in a kind of, in part because of its association with Leninism at this time. And those were, of course, the communist revolutionaries. I don't really tell their stories here, but they would get so caught up in the Second World War and this kind of priorities. So their kind of contribution to the revolution stuff would actually really become clear in the 50s and 60s, especially in India.
Sorry to I just want to open for Q&A.
Okay.
So wind up, and we'll come back to closing comments as well in a bit.
So can I just take 2 or 3 minutes
to
answer the kind of last other question that, okay, so revolution question is a really, major question, and hopefully we can talk more about it. Okay, so this is really an important question, critique of empire, and how, so here's my one thing I think. I do think that critique of empire was never a normatively particularly powerful ideal. I don't find any Indian political thinker of note who thought that empire as a normative ideal, as a kind of like they found, even those who supported empire, they did it often for what they thought a set of consequentialist reasons rather than for reasons of kind of like, let's say, kind of principles. So this is one thing, right? The other thing here being kind of like, how does this kind of course, Indians wanted to be free of empire. So how did this kind of influence or affect their program of founding? So here I'll say one thing about self-determination, right? And again, I focus more of in a more classical early formation in the Wilsonian movement in particular. I think the term's novelty is really clear at this time, and it is kind of a bit kind of lean as a term. And I kind of try to recouple the utter confusion that Indians had about the term. Some of them thought it's actually less than dominion status. It just means responsible government. It's actually, etc. And it actually did not have a lot of meaningful effect in the project of India's actually program of independence. So when Nehru was arguing for Indian independence in the late 1920s, self-determination is not a major presence. But, in terms of the larger kind of problem, Nehru basically goes on to found or leads the founding of India. You see a recognition of that. It's really a global event. It is a star of freedom, is to be shared with all of the kind of East Asia and Africa, etc., etc. There is a general dimension. The fact that British Empire was a global problem, and it is an immense world historical moment. The act of kind of coming out of it. But substantively speaking, once basically you had the progressive justification empire ran out, empire actually intellectually was very, very weak since the early 1900s. In India especially, liberal imperialism was not replaced by anything that is philosophically particularly respectable. So problem of empire, overcoming empire in many ways really became, for me, as I see it, a problem of kind of, how to globalize, for example, democracy, how to kind of make certain norms, international norms, kind of this mostly preoccupied kind of the kind of central concerns. Anyway, more to say on this, but I'll stop. Now, Udit, I hope you don't mind, but I want to kind of address very briefly the anti-colonial political thought point. Would you like me to come back to it toward the end?
Do go ahead.
I could end on this note if you want me to.
I've already invited questions, so while people are thinking of their questions and sending them in, do.
the question that both Humeira and Emma posed about anti-colonial political thought, and this is a question that all of us are thinking about in different forms. And am I absolutely right? I am not particularly persuaded by the arguments about paths not taken. I actually just had the pleasure of listening to a very wonderful talk by the historian Miriam Sinha at UBC just a couple of days ago. It is about basically her attempt to kind of reframe the problem of the nation state and to kind of recuperate. For example, she connected the question of program of Indian independence with the rights of kind of indentured servants. The fact that nation state, basically, the term to the nation state was so many other things than just, let's say, this kind of post-colonial elites kind of trying to monopolize power for themselves. It's a very complicated story, right? And it gets part of the work of PACT that I appreciate. But I think we lost basically the story about nationalism and its contestants became quite simplified over the last 20 years. And we saw basically, I guess, many areas about claims of paths not taken, federalism. Look, I think the federalist thinkers are absolutely brilliant. But their problem, they're not stopped by this post-colonial elite, post-colonial founders kind of who tried to kind of like, they were basically undone by their own philosophical dilemmas. And those are very deep, profound, respectable philosophical dilemmas. But this was not a story of kind of like unthought. This is not another story of feat of absent-mindedness. This happened for reasons. Of course, federalist things could be revived, but I think they should come out from kind of recognition of the deep and profound problems it faced, rather than a story of like forgetting that we are trying to kind of like, I guess, revive. But then the other question we posed very timeless paradoxes, a very specific problem about, the requires and I guess Humeira does equally kind of interesting questions about contemporary imperialism. With the difficult question, just feel free to stop me, but I'm going to continue in the meantime. So yes, I mean, partly because what I said earlier about the critics of empire, the fact that it is, I mean, of course, imperialism did not stop. It took new forms in the post kind of 45 era. And I'm actually just finishing up a paper on the idea of colonialism, and basically, which hopefully will be kind of telling the post 50s and 60s story kind of more clearly. I mean, we are kind of, our time, we're encountering the problems of imperialism in different forms. But this also makes us many ways kind of like, and maybe go to the interwar and this era with some of our own questions, which are completely fine, but it sometimes can be, let's say, kind of like prevent us from seeing some of the, pursuits or endeavors of these thinkers in question. So I do think that the main problems of post-colonial period, for one thing I was thinking a lot about, most people think about post-colonial period, they don't think a lot about authoritarianism, right? And especially those who work on India, partly because of this whole thing, Indian exceptionalism, that I was never particularly convinced by, that authoritarianism was a deep and a deeply ingrained aspect of kind of like post-colonial military rule, for example. All of Asian Africa, there's a deep history of, I mean, did this come out of nowhere? Is this just a story of aberration? I don't think so. I think it is part of the founding bargain and part of the basically, I mean, ways of thinking about, let's say, pop development. Of course, people like Nehru made one agenda about democratic founding, but others could tap into the same problem and make a non-authoritarian argument for, these goods that everyone desired, like development, like basically peoplehood, cohesion, etc. So some of the more pressing problems of post-colonial political life for me actually, are such as authoritarianism, revival of certain kind of, like India's case, kind of, for example, the return of the boundary problem in new forms that can't be explained away just by, looking at the problem of imperialism or, putting kind of, I guess, cunning spin on the decolonial kind of. So these are genuine problems that would need to be grappled with. But of course, this is not to say that problems of empire, especially the international side of the problem of empire, is something that the book does not engage with as much, right? And it's something that I would not claim. So this is something that I think is not a major part of the story. And I would not overreach here. I would say that, like, the reformation of the international side of empire and imperialism, remains very important and needs to be studied in its own right. But for post-colonial polity, the book makes an attempt to kind of ground some of the problems in the founding period and in the kind of choices that people made, and in the distinctly democratic dimensions, rather than making them problems extraneous to the tradition. I'll stop on this note. Thank you.
Thanks, Nazmul. Any questions, like I said, can be entered into the Q&A chat. While we wait, Nazmul, I think this is where I'm going to insert my questions for you. I really enjoyed the book. there's one slightly critical question, and the other one's not a critique, but it's more a question about the research agenda I think it opens up. The first one is, and I think you and I have had this conversation before, those of us who worked on this problem of peoplehood and unfitness for democracy, we do see that there seems to be something different about the conversation about democracy and fitness from, say, Victorian England, right, where the Reform Act is still being debated. There seems to be something different. But I've had some pushback on this, and so I'm just going to transfer those criticisms to you and see if you have an answer for me. One critique might be that, look, this is sort of a problem that's happened in 19th century England as well, right? Where there's this whole idea that some people are simply unfit for democracy or for voting representative government. And true, you've referenced Greg Conti's really good work on this in the book and said, look, there's a different problem there. It's about balancing classes, etc. And that's true. But even the balancing of classes, even that argument has an underclass who you're not even trying to balance. You're just leaving them out completely. The illiterate, the very poor, the homeless. Those aren't even people who are part of the matrix which you're trying to balance. So there is an underclass, even in English politics, which is simply unfit for self-government, representative government. And I guess the critique then is that at this point, it becomes not so much a difference in problem. It's not like the problem of peoplehood is unique to India, or the absence of people is unique to India. It's just that in India, even colonial officials are saying, sure, there's some people in India who are fit to rule, the elite class, the English educated class. It's a matter of proportion. In England, the underclass is small. Right? These very poor, very illiterate, the homeless, they're very poor. Whereas in India, it just so happens that because of historical reasons, it's a large majority of them. So it's just a reversal of the ratio of people who form this underclass. So one critique I get is that this is a problem that has existed even in English debates about democracy, which English constitutional thinkers have had to think about for a long time. It's just a sliding scale difference. It's not a qualitative, it's not a different problem. So that's the critique. The other question is more, like I said, it's not a critique of the work, it's a research agenda it opens up. And I wonder if you have any thoughts of this, which is that in post-colonial India, the problem of peoplehood is various problems of peoplehood. There are various aspects of peoplehood highlighted in different ways in institutional design, in policy questions, right? So how parliament's supposed to work, how parties are supposed to work, how federalism is supposed to work, but also policy questions like prohibition or censorship of films. And each of these are picking out different aspects of peoplehood. So I guess the book's giving us a broad brushstroke of this is the frame, this is the problem. But then in the 1950s and 60s, that problem itself breaks down into various different problems that get emphasized for different ends. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about the kind of micro history of peoplehood and its problems for democracy in the era after founding.
Thank you, Udit. So I know the first question, I know that it's not what you think, so I'm going to be very critical of this, given your work. So I will say one thing about that. It's a question that, of course, I thought about a lot about, especially when I first started the project. Because one question I used to get a lot. I mean, is only India like Italy? Like Italy had basically so many different kind of city-states and all that. I mean, the problem of unity is not. And of course, the other question about the fact that the question of fitness, of course, is a global problem. It is not a problem unique to India. And of course, I don't mean to say it's unique to India, but of course, there's something distinctive I want to say about the colonial world. Now, I mean, let's start with the British kind of story here, right? So the capacitarian language, of course, was everywhere in Britain in the 19th century. It is something that actually kind of like at the heart of a great deal of basically British political thought around representation and self-government. But at the same time, though, I think British political thinkers are, so if you take someone like Mills, I find to be like really clear on this point, was obsessed and very much kind of like preoccupied with the problem of, say, the backwardness of the English working classes and other things. But Mill was also absolutely clear for the fact that what makes England fit for, let's say, self-government is the fact that the English possess a capacity for collective cooperation, his word, right? The will and capacity argument means that, of course, a significant part of the British population, English population, haven't met the requirement, but by and large, it could be said that as a whole, as a people as a whole, they have met that requirement. So of course, what this meant for me, of course, finding more innovative ways of kind of, let's say, a proposal for plural voting or proportional representation. Some of these things were, both supposed to kind of educate the kind of those who are, unfit, at the same time also giving some semblance of, representative democracy, representative government as it is supposed to be. He was kind of like, able to work with both. It was very clear someone's like a Mill's account, but again, I could say the same thing for Macaulay, that the problem with India, yes, it's a problem of kind of, if one could say it's a problem of sliding scale, but quantitative difference sometimes become qualitative one. That India was just kind of not just a lot of Indians were so-called unfit, but it was basically fundamentally denied them of the abstraction called peoplehood. So this was really, really important, right? So for example, if you think about theories of parliamentary sovereignty, I've been reading some Dicey recently for some paper I'm working on, constituent power. And, or if you look at the debate from Austin to Blackstone to Dicey, this British parliamentary sovereignty, there's absolutely no doubt the fact that all this recognition of like different states of British kind of like, because it's more of a 19th century problem, the fitness problem. It did not undermine articulations of claims of sovereignty. Whereas in India, this kind of diagnosis of like states of people who did undermine the articulation of sovereignty. And so this is a major difference. I don't think we can really look past this. But this is not just it, right? It has consequences that are important to the post-colonial founding, to the larger story. So one thing that the book argues, I didn't really talk a lot about this today, is the fact that in part because Indians began to think about self-government in the 19th century as something that would actually develop the people. By developing the people, I don't mean the quotidian, everyday development. It was self-government was something that was meant to transform the masses into the people, which is to say sovereign entity. So you saw a reversal of the sovereignty government distinction. At least abstractly, we assume that self-government is issued by a prior sovereign authority called the people. In Indian case, it began often with a clear recognition that the opposite route would be taken. So this was how, for example, the Indian liberals throughout the 20th century even continue to think of self-government as something that is generative of the people. Even when Nehru basically, in a way, broke free of this problem, he had to kind of his post-colonial state retain developmentalism, not just as a policy, but something that at an ontological level, I would say, would generate the people. So Nehru really struggles between, when he articulates the people, they want independence, the immiserate masses, but they are not yet capable of resisting to the full extent. He does not ever articulate the people as those who are capable of will. Actually, the will discourse goes away, right? We see basically in that case a reframing of the, and as one thing that you argue, I think, and I mentioned in the book, the story that you try to tell about parliamentary sovereignty, the deflation of parliamentary sovereignty actually makes possible authorization as something that would lead to independence, but basically would free the people of certain kind of heavy civic responsibilities, which would allow the state to do its work. So this is, again, coming from a problem maybe of 19th century origin, but did not leave the kind of Indian founding or what would happen after. That leads me to your second question about the larger research agenda program. So this is, the story is told historically, but when you're thinking about popular sovereignty, peoplehood, I'm not sure if there are certain problems that are major problems, right? Who are the people? Okay, what kind of sovereignty? What do you mean by sovereignty? And what kind of government we need? Et cetera, et cetera. So so these are questions that are true everywhere. For example, anytime we see a mass popular movement, we see that attempt to transform the masses into people. It's part of democratic life. But this is, of course, like I try to clarify, not just kind of a matter of one turning, basically generating a popular coalition or generating kind of a authoritative voice. It was something so much more fundamental because it involved certain historical fitness, etc. But in the post-colonial era, the new kind of like, if you look at the policy level, smaller scales, like the growth of post-colonial state, the way they grow, for example, whether we look at legislation, we look at basically administration, we look at basically how kind of like post-colonial state involved itself in, different levels of society, from redistribution to kind of, modernization, etc. All of them at their own level involves various justifications that are done, developments are very central to it, right? In South Asia, we often we hear the word pro-people a lot more than, let's say, someone say that we are here to translate the people's will. And the idea of being pro-people is in many ways being fundamentally connected to this kind of like, in a non-will centric way of thinking about democracy, something that develops, the people, right? So this has infiltrated into different areas. And I think this is connected in many ways to some of the central problems of democratic theory, right? They are not necessarily, hopefully like this aspect, I mean, of course, it doesn't go into the nitty gritty, could help generate or could help shed some light on the kind of, I guess, the paradigmatic kind of place of the developmental state that came to be in the kind of mid 20th century and beyond. But I'm sure there are, of course, the same problem also applies to kind of ways of thinking about, let's say, kind of forms of pluralism. And I mean, this is a very difficult problem, of course, because thinking about oneness, popular oneness was so central, right? And for the Indian, South Asians made great sacrifice so that they could be united. And it means that kind of there is a distinctive challenge with ways of thinking about pluralism, but that can't quite look past, let's say, this kind of like, in many ways, very tortured history of like nationalism or boundary problem. So even in those cases, in smaller, I do think that we're always already under the shadow of some of the bigger questions. And this is something that the book doesn't do, of course, but I hope, to some at least, because it will be appealing for making sense some of the more background questions.
Perfect. Thanks. I have a question from the audience. The question is, can you say a bit more about the semantic field of a concept like the people in India? What are the terms and the languages in which this concept is expressed in India? And do these terms and languages have a longer genealogy that shapes this concept in particular ways? And this audience member is saying that they take your point about an intellectual break, but they wonder if a focus on language might reveal longer continuities.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I would say here, so let's say, I mean, the Indian language about which I can speak with more authority, of course, is Bengali. So, in Bengali, in both sides of Bengal, both in West Bengal and Bangladesh, I mean, you see a number of words for the people, Janata or Janta in Hindi, I guess, and Janagan being the more kind of like, I mean, if you're using it in a constitutional or juridical context, Janagan is often used, or Janashadharan, they're kind of word that we see quite a bit. And this word's kind of like, so the Janata, for example, is often used for crowds, whereas Janagan would be used for more formal context. And actually, Nusrat Chaudhary, an anthropologist, has done some really interesting work on paradoxes, or book in paradoxes of the popular, that trace kind of like the kind of like uses of the language in especially in contemporary Bangladesh. So these terms are often kind of shaped and formed in the shadow of, often, of course, they derive from often kind of like the Sanskrit kind of and the, in the middle Bengali cases, or even like Sanskrit, etc. I mean, Swaraj is another case. The word itself was not made up, right? But the way, for example, Janagan acquired or Janashadharan, Janata acquired meaning, these are quite fundamentally inflected by the new pressure that the kind of like these concepts were kind of putting in vernacular kind of like life as well. There's no story of continuity one could really tell about terms like Janagan or Janta. They are kind of many ways conceptually the novelty, I think, is quite in the 19th century was quite palpable. And I try to tell the story to a bit of a different context with Swadhinata or Shadhinata, the word for kind of like freedom and liberty, which I think I went close to thinking about it. And again, this is a word. This is actually was used in the kind of like in the medieval era once or twice, but never used for the sense of collective liberation, collective liberty. This is completely repurposed and given. A Bengali intellectuals like Bankim and Rabindranath, they had like lots of debate about a kind of like the novelty, whether the term could be seen as an older term or novel term. Most decided on the fact that it's an entirely novel kind of meaning is entirely novel. And Tagore went so far as to say that like it was kind of picked up from the street, is a very Western kind of inflected idea. So look, I mean, some of the stories, I think for democracy, people who hold key concepts, I think the stories of the break, as far as I can see, actually, I mean, are not that hard to kind of trace.
Right, thanks. I think, I have another. Yes, Rochna, do you want to come in?
Sure. Hi, can you see me?
I can hear you, but not see you.
Yeah, but we can
Okay,
hear you.
good, great, wonderful. Thank you so much for a great talk and for excellent comments also from our discussants. I had a related question. I can't wait to read the book. I haven't read it yet, so it's to press you a bit more for information, which you may have well had elaborated in the book. So to what extent is popular sovereignty posed as a problem distinct from national sovereignty and representative government? I mean, I know this is quite a broad question, but in many of the authors that that you're considering, because an earlier reading was that it wasn't posed as a sort of separate problem, right? And it seems to be that you're arguing against this, and I really like very much a retrieval of this project of democratic thought from sort of nationalist frames, but it does sort of beg that question, and I think it does go back something to some of what Humeira was also saying earlier. To what extent was this? Were these separated? And what was the understanding of sort of, representation and the role of the elites as representatives, which was thought to be absolutely central in a sense, and to and that mediation in a sense sort of prevents the emergence of the problem of popular sovereignty in nationalist thought. And again, that I suppose brings us back to this question of if you could more explicitly situate it in relation to the subaltern studies view, which is also, of course, that the authoritarian strands are present at the founding as a result of how the developmental state is conceived as a solution to the problem of nationhood or peoplehood. I'll stop there.
Nazmul, I have another question, if you could take them together, just because we're short on time.
Yeah.
So I have a question from Vineet, who asks, were there different ways in which Indian thinkers address the people problem in the context of princely states, so people under monarchical rule, vis-a-vis British provinces, where the problem is colonial rule and incremental self-government? So the question is if it's addressed differently in these contexts.
Thank you for both questions. So Rachna, thanks for your questions a lot, and reminding me about this other question that I think Emma and Humeira both kind of brought up. So very briefly, the questions about in the kind of way that I present the argument in the book, the distinction between sovereignty and government end up being very important. And representation here is tied up for me in many ways with the broader problem of government rather than with that of kind of popular sovereignty. So to elaborate this very briefly, so the key kind of like people who really set up the problem are the 19th century kind of so-called liberals like Nauroji and Surendranath Banerjee. And as I said, that they are not initially very consciously thinking about kind of these as a kind of like story of like, let's say, kind of a reversal of the sovereignty government relationship. What they're doing, of course, at this time, they're making that you know very well the arguments about kind of the educated Indians being the natural leaders of the people. This was something that, and the fact that they are arguing for limited representation, right? And at some point, of course, the demand for representation entail both kind of the local kind of whatever modic, small or tiny legislation there was, but also at the central level at the kind of British Parliament. And basically, because this claim to represent, that what was politically very smart about their agenda, right, was that they argued that basically allowing them to have Indians representation, limited representation, and participation in the civil services, actually, would be better way to kind of address the problem of India's peoplehood, which is to say they kind of make Indians both fit and kind of cogent and kind of like cohesive as a kind of entity. So they basically in many ways pitch self-government as the way to kind of sovereignty. So this is really what I kind of emphasize in the book. And then I try to kind of see different items, struggles that kind of ensues from this kind of framing. And the book in many ways also tells the story of like an attempt to undo this framing, but this is really at the core of the kind of problem that 19th century Indian political thinkers left behind for those who came in the heydays of anti-colonialism in the 20th century. And there's more to say, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move into the other question about subaltern studies and all of that. Of course, I mean, subaltern studies is something that you can see. I mean, I engage with this at a different level in the book, and I mean, like anyone who works on South Asia, of course, is kind of like, is something that I find myself thinking about often. And many ways, I mean, there's certain things, some certain studies that I concur with. I want to kind of course, I have my petty kind of fights about when to periodize the debate about. I do think Guha's and some others early work about improvement, progress, development that can often basically confuse the periodization story. For example, I'm not sure if we can read the 18th century necessarily in the same form as you do the 19th. These are more petty fights, not important to the larger story. But I do agree that the story about historicism, story about progress, as subaltern studies scholars kind of pointed out, that this remains a kind of a very, a generative kind of point. But of course, this is pointed out by a kind of host of scholars. We see in political theory this time Uday Mehta, and a few years later, Jennifer Pitts would kind of also point out imperial history. It's like Tom Metcalf and others arguing this. So this was, of course, a collective effort and post-colonial theory broadly construed, and within which subaltern studies, of course, had a very distinctive contribution. I do have my disagreements on some points. I do think subaltern studies ultimately also kind of tells the nation story that, of course, as I have discussed earlier, that I want to move away from. I do think the subaltern studies relationship with social theory and intellectual history, they are way more for me committed to kind of social theory and they often approach kind of intellectual history to terms of social theory that I'm comfortable with. For example, the passive revolution, for example, something that really shaped the interpretation of the post-colonial founding era. Prema, go back to your other question, I meant to say it earlier. This is an attempt to see India not as a revolution proper, but of course, as another kind of revolution, as a passive to using Gramsci's kind of framework. So there was this tradition that started. And, again, I find that to be inadequately kind of, I guess, it accepts, I think, a lot more of certain kind of social ontology of kind of the progressivist thought that I am personally kind of comfortable with. So these are some areas where I kind of want to depart from this. But I also, at the same time, is definitely very much appreciative of kind of their kind of study of the kind of like, if instead of talking about the colonial break, I'm definitely, I do not find entirely agree with everything. I'm definitely fall on the side of subaltern studies than with their critics. So there is a kind of lot of, I guess, as different kinds of engagement with post-colonial theory, the subaltern studies. Another point you made about authoritarianism, it is something that, you're right. I mean, of course, most subaltern studies and post-colonial scholars understood that the post-colonial found to be a bit passive revolution in many ways. So as I said, I'm critical of that side. But the authoritarianism mass elite story, the way it is told, in the first chapter 5 tries to lays out some of my problems with just making it a mass elite story. Nehru very much could be read also as a, many ways very much kind of like, he was just uttering masses all the time, right? So it is something that can be resolved at such a I think at that level. For me to do this, we have to kind of go a bit deeper. We have to look at basically specific commitments that their vision of development, visions of kind of like, post-colonial future generated. Anyway, so this is a lot of this is petty fights, so not important, but in general, of course, mostly the book kind of like, pays homage to some of their contributions while departing from some.
Perfect. I think that's all we have time for. So all that's left to do is to thank Emma and Humeira for their excellent comments, and to Nazmul for once again writing this excellent book and for responding to all our questions today. For those of you who are watching this on our website, please do read Waiting for the People. It's an absolutely frame-changing book, well worth your time. And thank you for those in the audience today, and thank you so much for your questions. Thank you. I'll stop.
Thank you, Udit. I really want to thank both you and both Emma and Humeira. These are really, really, generative questions. I'll be thinking about them, in the coming days, years, months, also. All right. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nazmul. Thank you, Udit.
If you just stay on for